Games in the Morning. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG. Today is Saturday, and we are talking about a rant that I've developed, and it's been a boiling one for a while. And we are talking about the position of role-playing and what has happened to it over time. I submit to you with my assessment here that role-playing hasn't aged well, and I'm going to show you the reasons why, and I'm going to start out with a bang and end with a boom, and there's going to be something for everybody here. So the one thing to state right off the top is that role-playing is not today what it was 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And so I realize that I'm going to be speaking a controversial statement here, so I expect some feedback and expect some response. Please feel free to leave a comment below, or if you're here on Twitch while I'm recording, go ahead and make a comment, and I'll be glad to respond to that while we're doing this. But my belief is that role-playing has not aged well, and there are specific reasons why, and I want to go over them in particular. First of all, role-playing as a mechanism is an aging play format. In other words, role-playing, the way we think of role-playing, has been around since our childhood. And when I mean that, in my case, 50 years ago, in other people's cases, even younger, when we were kids, we do role play. We literally play out roles in different kinds of settings all the time. When we were kids, we played at the office. We played that we were parents in a house, and we played sometimes we were astronauts and space cowboys or whatever. We played a lot of different styles of scenarios in a role-play environment going all the way back, and that type of play, that mechanic of play, has gone out of favor over time since then. The mechanic of utilizing die rolling to represent combat has fundamentally been wiped out by the video games market. There's a place to go where you can see your explosions, you can watch the lights go and the figures fly all over the place. So the idea of role-playing, traditionally tabletop, is an aging play format. Now with that, there's been an increase in expectation. If you have been awake in the last decade, you'll see that there are a lot of people who are making a critical effort to play roles on television, and this and of course the internet. But the idea here is that those participants are showing a level of expertise that simply doesn't show up regularly for a player at a tabletop. Yes, we feel, as we're playing role-play games, as we're enjoying the interaction, we feel that level of intensity, but it doesn't translate nearly as well as it does when you watch it on somebody else's performance level programming. So the idea here is that the expectation has constantly increased, even as the actual play output has decreased. Furthermore, you can look at a simple thing, and that is the cost of entry has steadily increased. Now, if we look at this compared to, say, the bottled water industry, the cost of production of a bottle of water has increased over time because the amount of plastics that have to be studied and all of that kind of research that goes into it has increased the cost of bottled water. Now, granted, there's also wonderful things like inflation and supply and demand and a lot of other sources, but the concept that, for example, when I learned how to play, I learned from a guy who taught me from his hand copy. There was never a purchase involved. The idea of play was simply downplayed in terms of valuation. Now, as time goes by and there is extra spare time laying around that other people can capitalize upon, then that freedom, that lack of cost has gone away, and there's been a constant increase. They just recently released the prices for the new versions of the Dungeons and Dragons game, and they are up to $65 per cover per book, and that also includes an electronic format. But previously, you would get the electronics copy from somebody who happened to be savvy and have a copy, and generally that would be able to mitigate the cost. But now it's actually ramped because you have to purchase the electronic with the paper copy because you're getting both. This therefore has caused the existence of it to increase, the cost of entry to increase. So a new player coming into it has to have already spent a significant amount of money just to be able to cross the threshold and begin play. Now, ironically, the process of advancement into a common culture and trying to expand marketplace has led to a decrease in the learning curve, which sounds great, but it also has meant a decrease in sophistication. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but all of you are probably aware of THACO, 2 hit armor class 0, that concept and that mathematical formula that was fundamentally built in and burned into the system simply vanished when they flipped the tables to make it easier to make direct comparisons, and therefore to demystify the magic system and the mechanical system. And by doing that, you actually flatten out not only the low notes, but you also bring down the high notes so that there is no grand successes and there's no excitement for the way a result happens. Instead, it becomes flat, because then it's easier to manage because it can be done automatically, mechanically, and therefore no longer be a challenge. This leads, therefore, to a concept of simplification. And I'm going to use that term somewhat in the derogatory definition. To simplify is to dumb down. And the concept here is that the media, in order to hasten the awareness and therefore help to drive sales, has actually simplified the process to the point of inanity. The idea of a combat situation needs to be resolved quickly and doesn't have to be done concisely, because we've created a numeric monster where we simply play bam bam. We roll dice and make a subtraction. Roll the dice and make a subtraction. Roll the dice and make a subtraction. This simplified mathematics formula has simplified the output as well, because now we can't do great definitions, because if you hit with an 11 and you hit with a 20, there's not much difference between them. And mechanically, they simply just made it so that you got rid of more hit points faster. So they thought it was simplifying, but it was actually simplifying, if you get what I'm saying. The idea here is that it creates this nuanced experience of feeling like the game has gotten easier to play, therefore it has a lower threshold for entry. But that lowering the threshold of entry means that the level of expectation at the top has also been brought down with it. Now, when we talk about this leads to people creating new ideas, new concepts, and one of which was the aforementioned video show, where participants were very critical in their approach to the roles they played. And this experimentation led to false positivity. In other words, a good storyteller, a dramatic storyteller, can enhance the visual outcome of a game, but a person who is a savvy player will see right through it. They'll look at the die roll and listen to the commentary and go, these don't match the storyteller is amplifying, and that therefore creates a demand increase. We want more outcome. We want more of what we see on the television or what we see in programming. We want that for our game, and so we expect this higher output from because of what we see as existential proof that it happens. And that leads us to therefore think that when we are storytellers and we are game masters, then we're going to have that similar response on the players. And it just simply isn't so. Because the quality of outcome will suffer when the simplicity increases. As something becomes easier to do and doesn't require as much effort on your part, then the outcome suffers. There's just simply not a way to make those two match. There's always going to be this disconnect. Finally, we're going to, penultimately, we're going to be talking about the fact that the economic pressures are moving game masters to charge for their games. When I was a young man, I was an entrepreneur and an enterprising game master, and I did charge for events going all the way back into the early 80s. But the mechanism was different. I would host tournaments, these events where the players would be competing to present their character as best as possible to earn awards. And the process of grading those awards wasn't left in the hands of the game master. The players would decide among themselves who it was that did the best portrayal of the character. And therefore the awards that were received were a portion of the cost of the operation, but I was generating a small amount of money in the process. Now, those of you that want to make your comments, please post them here. I'd love to talk with you and discuss this issue. But the concept was, to my players' idea, it was innovation. They were looking at a purchase of a games book that at that point was $15 to $20. But I would have a contest, and each person would have an entry of like $5 per person. But if you have a large enough audience to participate, then you get back into the system sufficient revenue to pay out that property and still put some dollars in your pocket. Now, I wasn't in it for profit making, and it certainly wasn't generating enough revenue to say quit my real job, so to speak. But the concept of it is that it put pressure on game masters because it costs so much to get into, and it costs so much as the game master. You have to actually make additional purchases over what the players have to. You have to be buying miniatures that are monsters for your players. If you have a visual component to your game, you've got to buy better and more sophisticated mapping software so that the visual output for your players is increased. I knew players that spent big dollars to purchase calligraphy sets and the like so that they could create the hands-on props that the players were hoping to find. And this process leads the game master to the point where they fundamentally have to charge. Now, in many cases, there's also pressure being put on the system on the other side by those persons that were challenging game store owners for the amount of hours of effort they were getting the game masters to provide. And so the store owners actually got to the point where they were involved by charging a fee for the table space. So they were actually generating revenue from people that for decades had not been paying to play. Suddenly they were able to generate revenue, and then they would give a pittance of that to the game master in the way of compensation. And while that is the most common model today, it's certainly not anywhere near the concept of minimum wage or anything. And no self-respecting game master would think about it from that standpoint. But the reality is that there is an economic pressure put on the game master because he is fundamentally the primary purchaser of games products. Now, there have been a couple of different points in the history of games where they've attempted to shift that load. The D20 glut, and later the concept of the feats and skills that a player can pick up from a given product being just as valid as others that were in the main production. This led pressure to the players to have to start spending as well, and it came with a fairly heavy backlash in terms of player participation either dropping out completely or being reduced, so the game masters now were struggling to get players at their tables. And so there was a competition level there. The idea here, though, is that there's something going on, and we haven't talked about, and it probably has not been mentioned yet, but that's the commoditization of role play within the industry. Now, you may not be familiar with what commoditization is. It's a big word, but a commodity is something that is bought and sold because of its quantity, not necessarily its quality. So a game master who hosts an event that has 6, 8, 10 players is fundamentally getting the same compensation as somebody that's running 3 and 4. And so therefore you have a really high quality game master who is generating revenue for your store, but you're providing him the same compensation as you do to another game master who only accommodates 2 or 3. You are harming the process, and you're making the people who are good game masters become disincentivized, de-incited, however you want to say that. They are no longer given a reason to stay in the hobby when similar skills can be used in many other places. I know a ton of people who in the games business were movers and shakers 20 years ago, and they are now sales managers, and they are marketing directors, and they are product supervisors and managers. And all of these roles are fundamentally what a game master did. Fundamentally, a game master is not only the motivator and the purveyor of quality play experience, but they're also the advocate. They're also the promoter. They are also the advertising arm, if you will, of those large role-play games companies. And so the commoditization has increased and continues to increase to the point now when your quality game masters are being forced to look at another way of generating revenue. Now, I've said all of that, and most people know that I'm a games publisher myself in that I produced the NycosRPG. And some of them are going to see this video and go, oh, you're just self-promoting, and this is just one way of showing how evil the corporations are. No, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, and I hope that you will share this with other people, the concept that we have given away the farm, so to speak, in the desire to have what we remember and what we would like to convey. My son called me several months ago and was just regaling me with how wonderful it was that he remembered all the different games events that we had at our house and how his friends were able to become part of our family by being engaged at a constant level every week because they were together throughout that. And he just was gushing over how much he remembered that and wished that were possible for his kids. But the reality is that the world has compartmentalized individuals out of the role-playing marketplace. The very idea of picking a time per week to go to a place in particular and sit at a table, it feels counterproductive. We look at our world and we say, no, I'm able to play my video games in the 10 minutes between action A and action B. So I can't do that in a traditional role-play game, so I'm going to pick up an online version and I'm going to play through that because there is a story. There is still a development of action that I can put down into bite-sized pieces. And the problem with that is we're now setting ourselves up for a situation where role-playing is not theoretically going to push past this point without radical changes. The advent of the recent attempt by Wizards of the Coast to define themselves by a completely different set of parameters failed in a way because we as players and those players who are even not yet involved in the marketplace could see the handwriting on the wall and push back. The games companies therefore retracted, created the concept of the Creative Commons licensing for the basis of the game, which actually is a argument for a defranchising, if you will, because the concept here is that the game mechanic of a player rolling dice against a threshold to come up with a success, that's been that way going all the way back. You threw darts to see who got the most points. It's not been different going into role-playing. So to destabilize that and to throw the bottom out and say we're going to Creative Commons the basic rules, but then we're going to lock the IP behind a franchise wall. This is standard process when we look at commoditization. I'm going to give an example that probably doesn't have any contextual tie-in, but I think is critically important. And I actually observed this happen as a third party when I was in the state of Washington some years ago. The Washington state area has been globally famous for its apple orchards and apple produce business. And there was a sea change in the way apples were bought and sold that occurred in this period when I was up there. And it had been happening for a while, but I was there during the sort of the death throes of the classic apples industry. And what I'm referring to is that prior to this, in the 1960s, 1970s, apple farmers, people who had apple orchards, were branding specifically for their orchard because of the specific trees that they grew, the certain size fruit that they were able to produce, the consistency of that fruit's coloration, size, and such was of a par that they were able to brand name themselves over others. And so larger apple orchards would get larger recognition. And those names that were apple brands by the farm names became the apple brands in the larger term. And let me give you an example. The concept of a Fuji apple or a Granny Smith apple or an American Delicious apple. Those were all brand names. Those were all actual individual farms that grew the largest quantity of the fruit of that specific size and quantity. Well, along comes a big corporation, cough, cough, Walmart, and they want to be able to access a larger quantity of apples, not caring about the quality. They want to make sure they're able to get the size, color, and consistency. That was the three things that my buddies that were in the business would always talk about. Kind, quality, consistency. That's what they were looking for. And those numbers, therefore, would create a need for a certain number of, specifically, an apple that would conform, generally speaking, to the Granny Apple description in order to put Granny Smith apples everywhere. So they would actually buy out the farm, the brand name farm, and then they would use that brand name to give a definition for size, color, and consistency. And by doing that, they could then go to an apple orchard farmer and say this: Mr. Farmer, you're producing 10,000 apples, using a ballpark number. You're producing 10,000 apples, and every season you have a certain number of them that go to waste because you can't get them sold. Either you don't have a good distribution network, you don't have access to transportation, there's something. We'll tell you what we're going to do. Normally those apples would have, say, a price of, I'm going to use an arbitrary number, $1. So they'll say you would normally sell those apples for $1 a piece. And that would generate basically $1 per thousand. $1 per apple would mean a $10,000 profit, for example. I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to do is I'm going to buy 100% of your apples, but I'm going to give you 60 cents on the dollar. That's a pressure put upon the producer. And the producer has two choices. He either has to say no to that potential sale, knowing that a certain number of buyers that would buy his apples are going to be going through that retailer. And therefore, he's going to reduce his overall sales by saying no. And already be in a marketplace where he's losing money from the apples that don't get sold already. So now he's increasing his losses. So he has to look at that with a good long hard look and say, it's better for me to get 60 cents on $1 than for me to get $100 per apple for a tenth of that, or a fifth of that, or even a quarter of that. The point is that it doesn't matter what the number is. It's a net win. Not a big one, but a net win to sell for the lower price. So now, anybody that sells an apple, and that apple's size, color, and consistency matches the definition of a Granny Smith apple, is going to sell 100% of their apples into a marketplace that will turn around, mark all those apples of that same color, size, and consistency as Granny Smiths, and sell them everywhere. And we all have gotten to the point where we always want to buy the best brands, right? So the idea of a brand name being a commodity is completely lost on the consumer, because the consumer goes, well, I want to make a pie, and I happen to know that Granny Smith apples that make the best pies from all the advertising that Granny Smith ever did. So therefore, I'm going to want to sell my entire inventory at that lower price. This leads to a slippery slope, because now not only does that farmer sell out, but then that same buyer can go put pressure on yet another seller and another and another. And furthermore, they create a conformity of outcome, because the person who's producing the apples has to forgo the uniqueness of his brand, because his apple is now never going to compete with a Granny Smith, because he will not be able to sell it at a low enough price to compete with the very apples he could have sold at the lower price in the first place. This leads to a cyclic process that devalues the apples. Now, I'm overstating the simplicity of it. I'm overstating everything here because I want you to see. If you don't get anything else from this video, I want you to see that we are talking about the commoditization of entertainment, and we are driving down the expectation of the consumer. And we see this in motion pictures and television programs all the time. The concept of what we can watch changes with every year because there are more offerings. And yes, there are some absolute gems. There's some genius pieces, but ultimately the ones that are genius pieces and that have that high value they price themselves out of the marketplace. There is no, I could use a specific brand, but I'm not going to use any specifics because I know that would obviate my story here and make it so that you'd be curious about it. So I'm not going to. But the idea is that when you have a quality output that's a one-off, then every other brand wants to take the pieces that worked for that one-off and put them to work on a property that's a ripoff. And so you don't get the quality that you saw in the original, but you get more. So you don't just get the quality movie every X number of years. Instead, you get a mediocre movie. You get a bunch of toys. You get product placement. You get marketing materials. You get all these things that cost virtually nothing to the producer and yet drives the dollars from the consumer into these weaker channels. And I know that I'm probably speaking, in many cases, people would say that I'm speaking out of turn because I don't know the industry that I'm speaking as well. I've been in the games business. I was the marketing director for the Game Manufacturers Association for several years, and I was the tournament liaison for Konami Digital Entertainment Incorporated, the producers of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. And I can tell you that the commoditization process is ongoing and still being utilized to this day. So, all right. So thank you, Strictly, for asking. And I just wanted to make sure I got through all of this, and I think I have. Let me officially close out this bit. This has been Jonathan Albin and NycosRPG. Role-playing hasn't aged well, a subsection, if you will, of the Game Master Soapbox, and I'll be back with more regular information after this break. So thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like the channel, and we'll see you soon. All right, Strigly. Yes, I'm glad you're here. So I will answer your question. What has changed in role-play games? And this may actually create a second video, so we may just have just cut the video into a couple of pieces, but I'll answer the question really easily. So what it was different in role-playing games. So let's first off start with Dungeons and Dragons, the original 1975 edition. First of all, the entire book was maybe 60 pages. It was a pamphlet. It was saddle stitched. If you know what that is, they would put staples along the outer seam of the book to hold it together. So it was only, I think, 32 pieces of paper folded over. So it was so small that they couldn't cover anywhere near the sophistication that we see in the game today. But nonetheless, they wanted to encapsulate the entire thing. At that point, they looked at occupation differently. We as Americans, generally speaking, and this is probably true in Canada and other countries as well, we look at a person's existence and we equate it to their occupation. So a person who works in farming is a farmer, and we just call it good. We don't talk about maybe he owns some cattle, so he's actually a rancher. We don't talk about maybe he's got a couple apple trees, so he's also an orchard. We don't break it down that way. We simply say you're a this and name it. So in Dungeons and Dragons, the original edition, elves, dwarves, halflings were playable, but they did not have classes. If you were an elf, you were an elf. If you were a halfling, you were a halfling. Now, what they did to make them unique and interesting to play is that they made it so that the skills base would equate to a class. In that period of time, the number one most read fantasy book was Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And so therefore, the halfling, the little bitty guy, was a rogue. Halflings were thieves. I mean, be honest, they used the term thief because they were knowing that Thief Baggins was a trope. And therefore, they swerved into that curve, so to speak. Therefore, if you played a halfling, you were automatically given the skills basis for a thief and were indeed considered to be a sneak thief, a robber. And that process included the other species. So elves and dwarves were also specifically codified so that the elf, for example, was the only methodology to be a warrior and a spellcaster. So you didn't have other alternatives. Now, in the first version, there weren't you were a fighter. There was not a ranger or a paladin. There were not any explicit definitions of anything beyond the concept of fighter. So yes, if you played a human, you could be a human fighter, you could be a human thief or whatever, but there wasn't even the concept yet of multi-class. The first change that happened when Dungeons and Dragons was rebranded as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and they put the books into hardbound and came up with a larger, thicker book, they had to complexify. They had to make the game more sophisticated. And this is the edition that most people that are veterans today started with. The Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was a huge weather change from the original. And as a matter of fact, at the time, anybody who stayed playing Dungeons and Dragons as the AD&D stuff came out, were considered the plebes. You know, if you were a real role player, then you were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. That was because there was a book that had substantive value. There wasn't yet the reprint capability of the internet. Yes, you could mimeograph or photograph a page or whatever, but it was prohibitively expensive to make duplicates by that fashion. So most people just said, go buy yourself a player's handbook. And many people did. Many people came into role-playing with only one book. They bought the player's handbook because it had everything that was necessary for a player. As a matter of fact, they released them in that order. They released the player's handbook first. Then they released the monster manual and then the DM's guide the first time around. After that, they realized they had to go DM's guide second. But that first thing was that the storytellers, the game masters, were also players. So they have to understand how the game works. So we'll sell the player's handbook first. And then we'll add in the additional fluff and substance for the storyteller later. That second, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was the king of the hill for a long time, and I have to say it that way because even when second edition came out, there were so many players that were in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that there was a concern that you'd bifurcate the market. You would end up with players staying with the original rules, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons rules, and then you'd have those that would go back to Dungeons and Dragons second edition. So there was a bifurcation. Now, what really happened was a secondary part of this commoditization process. As I mentioned, I've been talking about commodities and how the product itself has been devalued. But at the same time you're devaluing, you have to have something for the whales. You need to have something that's going to draw the big dollar, high echelon buyers, keep them playing. And so the idea of coming out with AD&D becoming the basis, changing back to Dungeons and Dragons, there was an entire product run, and this is not talked about a lot, but there was a property line that was produced that was Dungeons and Dragons while AD&D was running. They were actually still trying to hold on to that original property name, and these were called the Dungeons and Dragons Gazetteers. And the Gazetteer properties were trying to fill that gap. The Gazetteers were, if you played D&D originally, here's the way you can be cooler because you'll have additional materials that's not set up for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And so the D&D Gazetteer books came out, and it did have a limited success, but the reality was game masters like myself, we were massive consumers at the time, and we would buy anything that had role-play material in it. So yes, even though the Gazetteer property line was set up to be Dungeons and Dragons by the original branding and not considered to be AD&D, nonetheless, people bought them. And the Gazetteer products were generally aimed at, again, the commoditization process. So the one I'm thinking about in particular is that there was a property called the Elves of Alfheim, which is a weird combination. If you're a Tolkienian fan, elves aren't seen in any way as being similar to the Germanic tribes because the names and the conventions of them sound much more glossal. They have more L's and R's and S's in the names, and therefore the idea of switching over to Alfheim and taking on a hard German aspect was simply a divergence they were trying to create in the game that would allow the new elves of Alfheim to percolate through the AD&D marketplace, but still to keep the D&D name prominent. And for years that bugged me because I had all the advanced D&D books that had the big, advanced wording, and being a egomaniac, yeah, you're right. It's sad the game masters have to buy it all. But the real reason why they have to is that the players have a desire for uniqueness and interest and excitement. And a GM can do that work. But if a GM is doing all of that work and there's no compensation for him, then he feels thwarted. So he's going to take shortcuts. He's going to say, well, you want something new. That book on the Elves of Alfheim, even though we're not playing D&D, I can grab that gazetteer book and have the entire culture built for me, because there are people that are producing the material. And then I've got now an entirely new source so that my players will see it as unique and interesting, and yet I'm driving forward the branding that I want to have. So when Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition came out, I didn't notice the name change. This is an example of how blurred the lines were. Since I started playing D&D before there was an advanced D&D, and then advanced D&D came out, and then now we got another property coming after with a new name, I didn't even notice the fact that it was now Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition. They never had a 2nd edition of advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now, people look at that and go, what happened to the AD&D rules? Well, there was a brand purchase, like there has been in every version. So the brand that bought Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was separate from the ones who started 2nd edition D&D. And in that process is where you have a lot of this early stage complication. This beginning of the simplification. So Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition wanted to be a more inclusive property. And I'm not speaking inclusive like they mean today. What they refer to in inclusive in this case means we want to embrace more buyers. We want more people to own the property. So we're going to simplify it. We want to make it so that a person who has never been a game master before can start from scratch. And this also plays into a third aspect, and we haven't really covered it, and that is the concept of pathway to entry. If I am a game master and I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons, all I needed to play at the time was known classically as the blue box or the red box. The basic Dungeons and Dragons manual had everything in it in a single flimsy little booklet, and the stores would sell it for $15, and that would give you everything, including the dice, in one purchase. Yeah, exactly. Simple DMing. So that purchase got you everything. It got you the dice and everything. Then you ramp up. Now it's $15 a book. And you've got 3 books you have to own fundamentally to play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You have to have at least the DM's Guide, a Player's Handbook, and at least one of the monster manuals. Now later they expanded that to include other names that they were branching out with, like Fiend Folio and Monster Manual 2 and Tome of Horrors and a bunch of other branding titles that came from that period that they played with and tossed out from time to time to try to build the audience. But what that did is then a person who played AD&D wouldn't just have the Monster Manual. He would have the Monster Manual and the Fiend Folio and Monster Manual 2. So his purchase, his entry point to being a storyteller went up. And it's the push me pull you that we're still seeing today. The idea is we want to drive more money out of Dungeons and Dragons. So first we're going to raise the price on books. Okay, so therefore the same number of people will be buying more books. But then as you do that, you want to increase your audience, so you simplify and bring the price up to parity. But then you make it so that new property has fewer books. So now a game master has to decide, does he want to go with the old guard that costs this high dollar, shook the wrong hand, this high dollar value, and I want to pursue that? Or am I going to start this new property that takes less books? I can get by with 2 books with this one. That one I have to have 3. The price comes out to about the same number of dollars, maybe a $5 savings, but I'm definitely going to change. So then this one starts to creep up, but that volume of books you had to have to be a dungeon master becomes a barrier, because you have to have all those books. If you're a game master with your salt and you don't have Monster Manual 2 and you don't have the Fiend Folio, you don't have creatures that became iconic through those books, and therefore you're not complete. There's something wrong with you. So you also have to choose to switch to the new rung, so to speak, and climb that rope, and climb that ladder, or get stuck in your old copy. And Dungeons and Dragons has literally cut off its nose to spite its face every iteration. They find good quality game masters, they train them up, give them a large number of books they have to buy, they take the whales and they milk them for all they can, and then they switch horses. And so this game master who's stuck with all these books has to relent and start in at the lower threshold because he can't afford that big stack of books. So now he's going to start down at the lower end and start to build an accrual of the second book. Well, the second volume was even bigger. AD&D second edition was a hit. It was a simplification. There were pieces in that book that were strokes of genius. I didn't like the switch from THACO. I didn't resolve to do that. And so I was sort of caught in the advanced D&D mode of looking at combat as a complex, sophisticated, it was elegant, it was actually simple to do, but it took a mental gymnastics piece that made game masters seem unique and powerful. And the new system simplified it and made the plus system for weapons and the plus system for armor to be equitable. And therefore, now it didn't matter that your sword was made out of adamantium. That was not a thing. Whereas in the earlier versions in Advanced D&D, if you had a mithril sword, you knew it was +3 because mithril conveyed a +3. The new system didn't matter. It was a +3 sword, regardless of what it was made of. So now you could go +3 and mithril, and therefore drive up the perceived value while not changing anything for the players at all. You just were making more window dressing. And this was, I guess, the analog equivalent of the micro purchase. Because now that you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and it has these modifiers that are purchasable by the modifier, because you're now buying weapons that are listed as a +X, 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 +Y. All these weird arcane mathematics things. You're reintroducing the sophistication, but you've simplified the game to make it so that everybody else can enter. But now you start to have that book creep where the D&D second edition materials become larger and larger. They add the fighter's manual, the wizard's manual, the thieves manual, and all of these. Now they made them. They went back to a lower price point. They went back to the paperback, and they were using Perfect Bound, so it was a cheap glue that held those books together. So therefore, if you open them wide or you pierce the spine while you were folding a book open, the pages would fall out. But that's quality, and they weren't going for quality. They were going for volume. And so every game master had to have a set of all of those books in addition to his books. So the stack of books necessary to run second edition soon outstripped the original growth of the first property. Then they got the genius idea of, oh, this is going to be cost prohibitive if we continue to do this because the game masters are still having to buy a huge volume of books. Why don't we put the pressure now on the consumer to buy properties? And the beginning of that was what they call the D20 glut. The Dungeons and Dragons rule system was once again simplified from Advanced D&D down to Dungeons and Dragons, and now we are moving down to what was considered to be D20. And the D20 rules stripped out what was left of complexity. It definitely had the concept of armor class and hit points on the same scale, so the numbers moved up linearly. There was no real excitement between a difference of an improved armor by its quality, because there was no meaning to that any longer. The terms like adamantium and mithril basically vanished from the stories, except for in terms of the gifts and the prizes and such. But the actual items that people used, that was no longer an issue. It was, I have a +3 sword. And they oversimplified again, because when they did that, the +3 did not convey only a +3 on the 2-hit side. It also automatically conveyed a +3 to the damage. They simplified it because it was plus this and plus this for each weapon, but that was confusing. The players could not conceive of a +1 to hit and a +2 damage. That was just way more than the players wanted to follow, so they oversimplified again. But the D20 glut did something else, and that is D20 was an attempt by the original publishers to amplify the sales of their primary books in order to support their secondary market. So to play D20 modules, the creators of those modules had to put in the boilerplate of their text on the first page of their book in a specific place. It had to say, this property must be played with D&D Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, and Player's Guide. Those you had to have Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and DM's Guide. You had to. That was in the rules of the entire D20 Glut. But the D20 publishers were also small potatoes. Back in those days, a games manufacturer would literally come up with the idea of how many games he thought he was going to sell. Total. He would go and find a printer that gave him the greatest price for that publication. And he would produce all 10,000 copies that he thought he would sell over the life of the property. And he would bring it home and set it in his garage. And he would then sell to distributors, to retailers, to consumers, directly from that inventoried stock that he carried. And so the D20 Glut allowed a lot of littler companies, smaller entities, to enter the game playing field and produce new brands. And they all had to have that stipulation about the player's handbook. Well, gosh, a player reading the rules sees I must have these books. Well, if I don't have them, I guess I'll have to go get them. And if I already have them, then it's okay for me to add this to my property list. So those D&D second edition players that had an established playing inventory now didn't have to purchase these other books. But the players could buy them because these new properties created the concept of a prestige class and special abilities for the particular classes that property promoted. So if it was a Thieves' World, to use the brand, to a property that dealt with the life of rogues, then you would have fundamentally those people who were thief players go out and buy that book, bring it back to the game and tell the game master about it. Again, game master is now obligated to buy that property. He's got to add that to his inventory because he has to have the rulings that his players are working with. And although no one came out and said, you must also buy this other property, the game master the pressure was put on him. So while it did increase the number of players owning books, it also increased the number of game masters who were keeping up with that curve. So now you've got a threshold of entry that's bloated. There's now twice as many books for entry. And so again, the game master audience starts to dwindle. It's just, I'm not doing it anymore. We're talking about people that are going from their teens into their 20s. They're becoming married folk. They've got families. They can't maintain that spending threshold, so they have to cut it down. And so therefore they stay with whatever rule system they were stuck in. Advanced D&D had its own audience that was now separate. Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition now had a group that were their own people that didn't embrace the D20 movement. And now you've got a third group, which are the D20 group, who arguably did own the primary 3 books. But once you have a plethora of the D20 materials, the argument for needing a game master's guide and a player's handbook and a monster manual vanish. You don't really, if you've got enough D20 materials, you're able to cover it. Plus, D20 also broke the barrier on genre because you could get D20 modern or D20 horror or D20 western. There were breakdowns within the D20 market that were splintering the playing audience because they were now going in different directions in order to find uniqueness. They wanted to have their property be useful, but they didn't want it to be feeding the big beast, so to speak. And so the other genres came out of nowhere. And they didn't really come out of nowhere. There have always been additional properties done. Call of Cthulhu has been around nearly as long. And other genre materials have been around. But now with the D20 merging into that, those lines were being crossed and sales were being stolen from the other publishers, and it caused a problem as well. So now in the D20 glut, you've got the big pile of books. Again, Dungeons and Dragons got a problem. They're selling. They sold the company from TSR who had been building the Dungeons and Dragons model, and then the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons model, and then the Dungeons and Dragons model again, and now the D20 is rising above that, and D20 has new players that are arguably building quality property without the quality branding. So, for example, there were a couple of companies I could name, Paizo, that created high-quality role-play aids for the Granddaddy, but theoretically they could actually stand alone. The Council of Worms book by Paizo, the Shackled City book by Paizo, these were examples of a completely new way of marketing product, and this was a threat. Because those companies realized that the franchise rules of the Dungeons & Dragons model only applied if they also used the D20 label. So they could simply divert just enough of the material to be its own rules, and they could then chase that as a separate thing. So now Paizo's development process is now paralleling the D&D one, but it takes less books. You only need the Pathfinder book, just one book. You don't have to have 3. You only have to have 1. And the mechanics are fundamentally the same because you can't copyright ideas. You can only copyright the mechanism. I mean, reverse that. You can't copyright the mechanism. You only copyright the intellectual property that surrounds it. So the Dungeons and Dragons property, which never had a solid IP on its own, now had a competitor who was building their own. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just think about Pathfinder and their iteration of what goblins are. That little grinning, wide-mouthed, many-teeth monstrosity they call a goblin became the norm in the Pathfinder universe. And therefore, since it was branded, it was now a separate thing. And this concept led to the development of Paizo Publishing doing its own Pathfinder role-playing game. But it gets more interesting than that. When Dungeons & Dragons was sold from one brand to the next, the understanding is that the brand would create a new edition because all of the books would have to change. Every book would have to now have the service mark of the new company. So TSR, who had been the brand name for Dungeons & Dragons, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, now becomes TSR/Wizards of the Coast. And Wizards of the Coast has to make its own mark. And so they create the 3rd edition. Now, to a player, a reprint of the books was just a glossy polish. It's a silk. It's painting the toenails of a pig. It's still the pig. It's still the main animal. But now we're creating the 3rd edition, and that 3rd edition also took into account a further sophistication of the sales model of the company. Wizards of the Coast, far more sophisticated than TSR in terms of cultural advancement and business savvy, realized that they had to find ways to drive up player participation. They knew a game master represents 1/6 of a games group. If I'm only selling books to the game master, I'm going to have 1/6 of the sales I could potentially have if I'm selling to the consumer. So let's create a new mechanism, which are the feats and skills, the new feats in particular. That mechanism comes out in 3rd edition. Now, the 2nd edition rules still exist. If you are a D&D 2nd edition fan, believe it or not, that rule system still exists because a little company known as Kenzer & Company, in order to support their own joke product, it was originally a joke product, called Hackmaster, bought outright the rights to 2nd edition. And so the 2nd edition rules in their entirety are found in Hackmaster. All of them. The entire mechanism is inside of Hackmaster. Granted, they added some nice window dressing, some silliness and frivolousness, but they built now this outer mechanism and overlaid it on D&D 2nd edition. So those rules still exist. They vary experience points, bumps you're familiar with, the name, the class name distinctions all of those things still exist that were in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons are now in, in second edition, are now in Hackmaster. But the third edition, Wizards of the Coast's new product, and this is prior actually to the Pathfinder thing, so I got a little ahead of myself, but the idea is that the third edition created the feats mechanism whereby a player can get a hold of a property and the game master is in effect compelled to allow it because it does follow the experience point structure of Dungeons and Dragons. So therefore the taking on of these additional feats would customize the character, which feeds the player what the player wants: uniqueness, excitement, interest in their character, and does away with the game master having to be the only buyer. Because a player can bring a book to their session, there's no requirement for the other books to be with it because third edition doesn't have that same restriction. So the third edition properties with all of the new branding and all of the new feats and such are saleable directly to the players. And there was a raft, just a positive raft of property. So at first it seems like it's going to be outstripping the model. Third edition should outpace second edition, especially since second edition has now lost its name. It's now Hackmaster, a much less known property, and the term Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Dungeons and Dragons second edition are gone. Third edition is now moving, and they are positioned better. They've got a larger budget. They can produce more properties. They've got to carry more expansion. So it's a completely different animal now. So third edition, though, they did something more egregious, if you will. They produced the same 3 books: DM's Guide, Player's Handbook, Monster Manual. But they nearly doubled the price. So a book that had been $15-ish for years, now to get the base book, you're talking about almost $50 for each book. So now per game master, you're getting a larger amount of money, even though they only need that 3 books. The players then start buying other manuals, and then the game master, by de facto, has to either buy or at least accept these new rules into his game. Add to that, many of the feats were specifically written to undermine the game master's power in the story because players had developed this concept of the player versus game master, that it was an adversarial competition. To the point where a player would come in and play gotcha by dropping a new book on the game master saying, yeah, I'm taking the feat on page 315 of this book. This is what we're using now. And so the game master loses his agency. He's no longer in charge of the game. He's not being the proponent, the giver of gifts, the awarder of experience points. Instead, he's becoming a workhorse of the engine. And you have another great game master die-off. Game masters switch properties. There were other games that were coming out in this period of time that were very enticing. There was a Star Wars RPG put out by a separate company. There was a Lord of the Rings RPG put out by another company. There were ancient companies that were coming back out of the woodwork, like Iron Crown, who had originally had a tentative Lord of the Rings license, lost their way, and then eventually came back. So these varying properties now are pulling the game master pool apart. Dungeons and Dragons no longer has that solid group of game masters, but you have a lot of players now who have enough knowledge that the players can actually create an environment, and I'm not kidding you, where the players are playing together without a storyteller per se. The game master is actually playing his character in the game as well, because he's still wanting to advance. He's still got a player mentality, but now he's playing his character in the story along with all the other players to get to their ultimate goal, and therefore they're now playing a lot more player versus player. And this was also seen in the electronics market in the same time frame. If you look at the process of companies like EverQuest or early World of Warcraft, these concepts were stridently player versus player. If you came into that game and weren't aware of the fact that the other players were going to come over and beat you up and take your stuff, you didn't play. And so it changed the mentality of the players to be much more selfish, much more goal-oriented, well in advance of the leveling process. if you go back and look at the players in the earlier days of Dungeons and Dragons, the players were looking at characters like Conan the Barbarian or even Sherlock Holmes, and they're seeing a development or an advancement of that character over time and his sophistication improving over time based on the experiences that he had. And so it was a one-to-one relationship. So they depended upon the game master to give them those advances. Now, with the feats structure that 3.0 and then later 3.5 would have, that shifted. And specifically the 3.0 to 3.5 conversion point is interesting because it's also when Pathfinder finds its own feat. So the Pathfinder property, which is actually Dungeons and Dragons 3.0, 3.5, that rules mechanism was actually again purchased. Paizo bought the rights to produce games under that model because Wizards was being bought out by Hasbro, and Hasbro had yet another model they wanted to try. And most people, again, don't see this because they're seeing it from the inside. They're watching the game that they're part of expanding and changing and growing, and they're not seeing why. And the reality is that the company purchases that are going on is driving this. So Hasbro, unlike Wizards of the Coast, didn't have a horse in the roleplay world. They didn't. They had no idea what they were getting into. But they did understand the electronics market. As a matter of fact, when Hasbro bought Wizards of the Coast and all of the Avalon Hill and all of the other properties that Wizards had purchased, when they bought that outright, they turned around and took all the electronics properties, bundled them together, and in the same agreement, fundamentally, they sold all of the Avalon Hill War Games catalog to a company out of France called Vivendi. And so all of that really high, sophisticated, grognard thinking, really deep and intelligent war games mechanisms went out of the country. And Vivendi's model never did recover. They never did come back with a salient set of properties that were the Avalon Hill titles and such like. So that we lost a lot of advancement in game theory, if you will, at the playable level in that exchange. But Hasbro's model for Dungeons and Dragons going into the 4th edition was driven by World of Warcraft and other MMORPGs. Because what they realized is that the micro-purchase mentality, the idea of shuffling pieces on a piece of paper, is what we do when we're playing a video game, when we're adding skills to this and moving things around like that on a video screen. They wanted that for Dungeons and Dragons. And so 4th edition, again, just like 3rd edition was a departure that put players in control, now we're bifurcating again, and 4th edition is going to come out, and 4th edition is going to be a video game on a tabletop. The idea was that it's cross-pollinated and has come back around. A great example in board games would be the process of Civilization, a big chunky Avalon Hill game, very difficult to play, created by Sid Meier's into a computer game called Civilization, has the same name, has the same concept, but is a completely different mechanism, is developed. And so Sid Meier's Civilization as a video game was far outstripping the people who were playing the classic Avalon Hill version. There was no competition. So D&D thought, we'll do the same thing with the Hasbro folks, and we'll do that with Dungeons and Dragons. We'll create a model that's more like the toys that we sell, more like a computer game, and people will love it because it's going to give them the member berries for the times that they were learning how to play the video game. Well, everybody knows what happened to 4th edition. No takers. It was dead on arrival, fundamentally. And so they immediately had to scramble. So now we come closer to the present. With the death of 4th edition, they had to do something. So the people at Hasbro got clever. And in a short period of time, and I don't have the years in front of me, but they turned around and hired people who were actually giants at the time in the role-play business that had actually done success with role-play mechanisms for other brands, for other companies. Bought them, if you will, brought them into the house and said, make unto us a game unto thine image. And 5th edition was created.
It was still an oversimplification. It was a re-simplification of what was already simple. It was a streamlining of that which had already been streamlined, and it was an emasculation of anything that was left interesting or challenging in 3.0, 3.5. Stripped all away. As a matter of fact, when they released it, one of the major stipulations was there weren't going to be any feats. There was a certain small list of them included in the game, Dungeon Master's Guide, but the original version of 5th edition basically said the feats are dead. That the feats mechanism is gone. And they did one more thing, and this, from a stroke of genius standpoint, there was one rule they added that made Dungeons and Dragons, the fifth iteration, every bit as subtle and useful as the earlier editions, and that was the rule about advantage and disadvantage. Now, if you don't play role-playing games, you don't know what the H I'm talking about, so let me explain. A roll of a dice only generally has one outcome, success or failure. Generally, though, if you are playing with a person who is particularly savvy, they will leverage it so they only need to roll when they pretty much have got enough modifiers together to guarantee a success. So realizing that there should be still some level of vagary or randomness in the game, they came up with the concept of advantage or disadvantage and put that in the hands of the game master. In other words, in a given situation in a game master can determine that on this dice roll in particular, you have to roll twice. And either choose the best if you have advantage, and choose the worst if you're at disadvantage. And what this does is it takes into account the concept of the economy of dice rolls, that the more rolls you get, the more average the response will be. So therefore, if you give advantage to the die roll, you're leveraging upward the chance of success. And if you're giving disadvantage, you are averaging to the lower, to the failure, the die roll. And that mechanism worked. The very mechanism of advantage, disadvantage gave back the power to the storyteller, so that even if somebody did have a monstrously high stacked group of feats and skills, a game master could say, yeah, but that's at a disadvantage to roll again, and therefore take the worst, and therefore the chance of that number being lower was higher. If you get what I'm saying. And this mechanism for advantage, disadvantage, in a lot of hearts and minds of game masters, myself included, this was panacea. This was what we'd been waiting for. It was the place that all of a sudden said, game masters that have been in the closet, game masters who gave it up decades ago, we're back to an entry point. So the buy-in is still only 3 books. DM's Guide, Monster Manual, Player's Handbook. But now with these 3 books and that one rule, you now have the even playing field, and now you've got the leverage that's needed to put the players back into the relative position of being subject to the story or part of the story. Now, it didn't take long for them to completely ignore that and begin creating feats and skills and destroying what they had built. But the idea of 3.0 was, of 5.0 was to give back the power to the game masters and bring them back, because those were all buyers who had quit. And so there were a huge number of people who came in and bought books into Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition that hadn't bought a book in decades. And so it was seen as an expansion of the marketplace. And this leads into some of the stuff that I said in the first hour. This aging process now is a problem, because you're telling everybody that you have an increasing marketplace, but you don't. You have a bunch of old veterans that are relenting and coming back in. That brings us to where we are today, and that is the 5th edition has now outgrown its utility. You can't just get by with the 3 books anymore. You've got to have Tasha's. You have to have Xanathars. You have to have Mordenkainen's. You have to have Spelljammer. You have to have Eberron. You have to have these. Each one of these books has enough requirements from the main book that while you didn't have to have it to play at the beginning, now you do to keep playing. And so therefore it has reached that level of breakthrough entry level freeze. People aren't coming in to play the game anymore. So this is the first time where they've actually done what I've been arguing they've actually been doing the whole time, and that is this is the first time they've done the Emperor's New Clothes. And that is they're saying that the D&D 5e 2024 rules is 5e. We didn't change anything. We're not making anything different. It's exactly the same game you bought into a decade ago. So you still can get by with those original 3 books. No. These new books that are coming are going to have rules and stipulations that fix the new framework at this new starting point. And they're adding in VTT and all of the video requirements as almost parody, because a game master has to have something visual. He has to have something aesthetic. He has to have something attractive. And a game master generally is a storyteller or an artist or a statistician, but not all 3. Generally, he's one of those and really good at it and has failings in the others. This blows that away. It says, no, if you're going to be a game master, you're going to use our properties. You're going to let your players use our mechanism online so that their characters will be coherent with everybody else. We want to make sure that everybody feels like the cool kid. So you have to play. You have to play ball in our court. And this is where we were reaching now at yet another Waterloo. And I think this is where role-playing is not going to age well. And that's because all of this entire discussion, we're now going on over an hour that I've been going. This entire discussion is predicated on a mechanism that is 1960s technology. Let that sink for a minute. 1960s technology defined role-playing games. Way back. Before I started playing, this mechanism was established. In World War I, World War II, and in the wars afterwards, the United States discovered that you can win a war by not by defeating the opponent's sophisticated military units with better military units. That horse was already out of the barn. You couldn't win on that. You had to find a new lever. And what they realized is that you take away your opponent's war fighting capability, and if they cannot fight a war, they will surrender. World War II, we beat the Germans, we beat the Japanese by bombing their fuel sites, bombing their production facilities, bombing their repair facilities, bombing anything that let their machine move forward. And what had been originally, considered foul play to go after the enemy's camp or going after the enemy's food supply, that was, dirty pool. Now it was not only essential, but not only was it convenient, it was essential to take away their warfighting capability. This equates in war games to the concept of a logistics pool or a hit point pool. Dungeons and Dragons uses hit points, other games use other terms. But the idea of having a large puddle of life essence that has to be withdrawn before you are eliminated from the game was, and as the mechanism currently stands, will always be how those games operate. And I know I've said all the other to say this bit, but the reality is that is what's going to be the death knell of role-playing as we know it, because that is not the way we as human beings work. We do not have an organ someplace that has all of our life essence. There's not a concept of a blood bag someplace that if you puncture the blood bag, you prevent me from being able to fight the war. That's just not the way we as human beings work. We put 100% of our effort into everything we do all the way up until we have a bitter end. And the NycosRPG mechanism allows for this. You're actually operating off of a pressure system based on your fatigue, for lack of a better term. The energy that you have to work is 100% all the way up until it's not. But you do have a constant drain on that based on injury. So therefore, the more injured you become, the faster you're losing your energy, and therefore, naturally, there are less things that you can accomplish. And that mechanism does cause you to consider your actions in a game and consider what point success exists. That's first. Second of all, it has a mechanism where the win or loss is actually dependent on winning or losing. I know that when we look at historic warfare, we see the great monstrous battles, Battle of the Bulge, and we look at the Battle of Agincourt, and we see these individual battles in a threshold of saying they're isolated incidences and the winner or loser of that thing mattered. But in reality, it still has to do with that pressure pool. Battle of the Bulge was dangerous because they got dangerously close to the resource engine behind the Allied forces. That was what was made it scary. That's why the Battle of Bulge is so dramatic. Battle of Agincourt. That battle was really fundamentally won by attacking the base camp of the other, and that's not something you're going to hear a lot about. You're going to certainly hear about 300 archers versus 3,000 cavalry and how great that victory was. But it's far more inglorious than that when you actually look at the details. Feel free to look those up, because I'd love to hear your comments if you come into those discussions and don't see them the same way I do. But the point I'm trying to say is that this mechanism, hit point pool, take away the hit point pool, you win, is still in every game that's come out for the last 3 decades. And that's what NycosRPG, what that really is triggering, is that the reality that that's not the way we fight wars, and never have. And the NycosRPG mechanism creates a more cinematic and a more realistic, if you will, concept of success in battle. Success does not mean that the war ends. Success means that the battle was decided. That means that the conditions of the battle changed at that point. And that's all it means. It's only when a player decides to quit or decides to surrender that the battle is over. And so a mechanism that allows you to literally fight all the way to the bitter end, it makes more sense than the bam bam argument, because in the I hit you, you hit me, I hit you, you hit me mechanism, there is a drumbeat of unreality that comes to the fore, which was the reason why Dungeons and Dragons was so successful, because the concept of the hit point pool was the first place they could go to where they had a proven example of it actually working. World War II proved that asset reduction wins wars, and so they put it into play in the status of hit points, and it has hidden there like a tick the entire time. And it's only with the development of the NycosRPG and the quantum die rolling mechanism, the QDR, that the world has changed. And I know that I'm the person screaming in a snowstorm, and I'm not going to necessarily have somebody hear me. But if you get this and internalize this, and you see this in this video, and you share this with other people, then we get the word out. We can change the industry. We can change and make everything a new revolution. Now, right now, the NycosRPG rulebook is available for $10 in PDF form. And I know that sounds like I'm now self-promoting, but the reality is that $10 is just going to let me continue to do this and get this information out to people. Because the more players that we have that are moving to a system that makes sense, we're able to put back the joy and the fascination and the sense of wonder and the benefit of the doubt, and all of the things that are missing in our culture can happen again. I know that sounds crazy. I know that people are going to want to call for me to be certified, but the issue here is that I'm telling you that what we have faced in the evolution of games that took me this hour plus to talk about is the reality of the world we're in. And if we want to change the world, we have to start with the way we actually enjoy ourselves and find new ways to play. I invite your commentary. I invite your response. Strigley, if you've got something for me that you'd like to take from this and talk about, I'm glad to talk about it. I'm now ramped up and going, so my energy level is through the roof. But I'm going to do a second call for the game and say that, guys, this is the end of this portion of the video. I've talked about nothing on the screen. Matter of fact, I may find a way to change the screen so that this will make sense to you. But the reality is that we are talking about a weather change in role play. And if you get any of this, even just a little bit, it'll change the way you play. And if we change the way we play, maybe we'll change the way we do everything. Thanks a lot. I'm Jonathan, and this is NycosRPG. See you soon. Okay, Strigley, let me have it. Where did I go wrong? Where did I push the buttons? Where did I go too far? I hope you were able to follow all of that. I was getting going. And I have not ever been able to put it that concisely, so I'm excited over that video because I know it's an hour long, and so it's going to be, I probably have to break it into individual pieces or go back and treat. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's hard when you're used to role play as everyone else is doing it, and somebody comes along and says, here's a new system, everybody does the same thing, which is, oh, a new system. It's the same thing, right? With different paintbrushes. Thank you. Yes, exactly. It's a change in the way we think. And I guess, I know I made this reference early on in the conversation, but it's like the bottled water situation. I know everybody likes to focus on that one, but in my childhood, if you were thirsty and you were running through the neighborhood, you just turned on anybody's garden hose. Yep, exactly. So that's the reason why the players sheet, the portfolio sheet, is available from NycosRPG for no cost. You can just go and get the character sheet. Then by watching my videos, you can learn how the mechanisms work. And on Saturdays, you get the opportunity to actually play. Because I actually ran a game this Saturday where I, as a game master, was playing with the viewers. So the person that was actually watching the video was playing the other role in the story. So I was narrating for the others. Oh, wow. That punched me in the face. Yeah, it's always been there. I didn't clearly state it. But yeah, go to NycosRPG.com, and right across the top, you'll see it says character sheet. Yeah, you're right. You're right. The push pull on that is that if I'm creating a video and I'm only constantly stating, here's where you get the character sheet, here's where you get the character sheet, that feels like self-promotion. And while it is self-promotion, it's actually promoting the mechanism more than me. Because if you have the character sheet and you have the rules, you're running your own game anyway. So that's fair. That's fair. I will definitely endeavor to do so. And do you mind? I will definitely give you credit, Strigly. I will let people know that Strigly from Twitch is the person that gave me the idea. So that's actually good. Well, thank you for that. I've been doing this for a while, and I've been struggling for decades. I mean, I didn't understand or discover the convention marketplace. I don't know if you know about games conventions, but across every country and around the world, there are games conventions where groups of people get together and play in large numbers. We're talking, 3,000 to 20,000 to 60,000 people getting together. In Europe, there is the Essenspiel, a game convention held in Essen, Germany every year. And there are, I think they said there's like 20 or 30,000 people that converge on that city and double its population. Sure, and they're all for sale. If you're looking for D&D plots and storylines for homebrew, RPG, DriveThruRPG.com and RPGnow.com. They definitely have a throat hold on the industry because they're actually owned by. Yeah, I know exactly what I'm talking about. Matter of fact, one of mine's still there. There's a module of mine called Vagabond Mountains, and it is actually a one-shot. It's not a one-shot. It's a 3-episode series that you can get. So Drive-Thru and RPG Now are the two primary ways of getting to homebrew material. I would posit that the better way is to read a good novel in any genre and then swap out all the characters. And that becomes your next one-shot. So, okay, so yeah, that's. I'm glad you asked that question. As a matter of fact, our new subscriber, Huso, he came on today and was playing in the RPG game. He was playing a character whose name was, just a second, I'll tell you what his name was. Bombador. He played a Grund, a dwarf named Bombador. Anyway, Bombador came up with the the same issue that he's a game master that doesn't know how to do creative stuff. So, okay. Gotcha. Okay, so here's what you need. And let me change my header on the page if you don't mind, because now we are onto a subject that is completely different. So let me go back and change that. Let me catch up there. Alrighty, so this time I'm going to shut off all these windows and then I'll come back and turn them all back on. But I want to do each one at a time so I can go in and type and change them as we go. Alright, so one shot. It's a great phrase. One shot. Let me see, where's my... Okay, let's see here. Come on, fingers. Fat fingers get in the wrong typing place. Okay, so we're going to do some terminology defining real quickly. And when you say that you want to do homebrew by definition is house rules. This is in the olden days when a person was playing poker and they decided they wanted to do something to make their game unique. They would say, okay, one-eyed jacks are wild, or suicide kings are wild. And that change in the rule meant that the dynamics of the game would change. So when a person says they want a homebrew, what they're really saying is you want to change the rules. So I don't think that's really what you're asking. I think, yes. Right, so I'm just clarifying that the concept of house rules, meaning homebrew, has changed. It now a homebrew or a set of house rules is actually... Oh, where did it go? That's not it either. The second point here is... Homebrew now means non-canon, which what that means is that when I'm telling a story, I'm not following a franchise materials product. That's what a homebrew, again, defined as. So a house rule and a homebrew kind of the same way. Now that's not what people are using it for. Now they're saying a homebrew means I'm just running something that's one shot. And one shot... I don't know what happened to my typing. It went away. I don't know. There we go. One shot really means one encounter. And if you can get your mind around that piece, then all the rest will fall into place. And when I say encounter, I am specifying what the intent of the adventure is supposed to be. And so what ends up happening is that players look at modular material, and the modules will always have, there's a monster in room A, and there's a monster in room B, and there's a monster in room C. By the time you get done playing it, you're actually 3 weeks or 4 weeks later. So, yeah. So Exactly. Homebrew means non-canon. Literally means homebrew is not franchisable material. One of the things that the new version of Dungeons and Dragons, the new and improved 5e, is going to have fundamentally stipulation that you have to have their license. You have to have a permission from them to use their intellectual property. No, it's not. Okay, so I'm glad you asked. D&D 1 was one attempt at this. D&D 1 is the first attempt they made. Then they scratched that in reverse and it says no. Well, actually, they had a version before this that they were going to make, and then they changed their mind and said, we're not doing a 6th edition. It's going to be D&D 1, just one set of rules. But they had already promised that in 5th edition. They actually used that in the marketing 5th edition, that it was going to be the one rules to rule them all. And can you link what? Oh yeah, they've done tests. You can put the link in here. I've not played it. You probably have to put it in quotes or something. I don't know the mechanism, but it might not let you. But the issue is that the intellectual property rights of Dungeons and Dragons really only extends to, no, it didn't. I got 3 asterisks, so it did not. Just if anybody wants to know, we can look it up, and I can put it in the. You can send it to me via a direct message, and I'll put it in the show notes afterwards, so people can get to it. I don't have the link for it. And I assume that the first 3 dots would be the actual brand name, because it doesn't say. It's just, again, blank 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 .com. Okay, but anyway, the point is that the intellectual property only extends to those items that they own. So, for example, the majority of the monster manual would qualify as being theirs, except where it falls into common usage. So they can't take the word troll or goblin or gnoll or whatever, those basic monster types that we all know from fairy tales and such like. They can't appropriate. But other items like the beholder or the owl bear, those are all distinctly Dungeons and Dragons property names that came from D&D materials. And so they can actually hold on to those and license those and make it so that you have to use their name and their branding to get to those items. So the question you really asked, though, at the beginning, if I'm restating it correctly, is that you are looking for homebrew material for even one-shot adventures, and you're finding yourself stymied because you're not sure where to find it. So what I want to point out is that a one-shot is really one encounter. So if you choose a monster or a theme and you want to run just that one part of the story, that's how a one-shot works. It's the easiest way to do it. And you can therefore... Okay, exactly. So that's what I'm telling you. So a simple homebrew mechanism will follow a certain outline. So let me see if I can give you the steps to the outline. Number 1 part is to know your subject. Yep, exactly. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I'm doing currently is I'm actually writing modules under that specific limitation and selling them to a game store owner who is franchising it for other game stores. So I'm already doing that, so to speak. So the first thing you need to know to run any one shot, and literally you can write one while we're sitting here talking, Strigley. When we get done with this little part of a conversation, you'll have your very first one shot, all right? So first of all, pick a subject, a monster type, or a encounter type you would like. When I say encounter type, is it specifically a cave crawl? Is it specifically a prison break? Is it specifically a a hunt and gather. What is the theme do you see? What subject do you want to pursue? You mention it, and we'll go with it for this conversation. But you're going to want to know your subject. You want to know what you are running the playthrough. Yeah, it won't be common, and I'll explain that in just a minute, because there's exactly a reason why this information seems arcane, and it sort of is. Okay, so it's outside of a farm. So is it an animal heist? Is something stealing animals? I mean, that from a classic standpoint. Yeah, okay, so cattle are going crazy. That's great. That is your subject. Cattle is going crazy. So now, in the micro, not in the macro, not in the large world-changing thing, but in the micro, what is scaring the cattle? What is causing them to go crazy? Is it something they smell? Is it something they can taste? Is it something that physically is being done to them? What do you see as the thing? Don't have to give me the creature. Just give me what you think the thing is that's causing the animals to go crazy. Okay, good. Okay, so the first thing was know your encounter. The second thing is to know your mechanism. And when I say mechanism, we're talking about what it is that is going to drive this encounter. You'll hear people talk about the drivers in an adventure. And often the players are the drivers. But in this case, you're setting up a one-shot, so you need to be able to explain, at least to yourself, why these things are happening. So something's being added to their water or food. Now, those are two different things, so it could be either or both. So there's nice to have a little bit of mystery. But if you know your animals are going crazy, now, next question would be, when you say knowing your subject, what are the symptoms of this craziness, this weirdness in the animal? Are they getting sickly? Are they changing colors? Do they have fat tongues? What is it that is going to be manifest about them? Because once you know the subject, you have to be able to convey that to your consumer. So the player playing your game needs to be able to be reached with the message. So if I used to say, "Oh, there's something crazy about your cows," that maybe not going to do anything. But if I hear that the producer of meat in my town isn't producing meat, and the steak that I just bought is going to be twice as much tomorrow because there aren't as many red eyes, unnatural predator. So your herbivores are going carnivorous. Okay, good. All right. So what we have here basically are disease characteristics, and therefore a player knowing how disease works by our understanding is going to convey that information to the player, to the character. The player is going to understand this way before the character, because a character seeing something getting sick is going to say, "Oh, it's an evil curse. Call the wizards, right? Call the church. We need to get the seers out here." Okay, so do you have an idea of what you want the solution to be? Okay, you have an idea. This leads to the next part. You need to know your antagonist. Exactly. Who might be behind it? Who might be behind it? As a matter of fact, if you think about it, this is typical detective work in most movies today. Is we need to have a motive. So we need to know who the antagonist is. Is there a reason why he's doing his dirty business now? Is there a reason why this didn't happen before? Is there some catalyst that occurred that set him off? These are all the kind of questions that the players are going to want to ask themselves, right? And you want them to ask it, because then if they're asking this question, then you know they're getting what you're trying to lay down. Okay, so let me ask you. You're the storyteller here. Is there somebody behind it? Or is it just a natural occurrence because the water got tainted someplace? Because that in itself can make for an interesting adventure, because if they think that it's somebody and they go around making accusations and it finds out to not be true, they could be okay. So you're saying that it actually isn't an antagonist. This is good. This is a nice subterfuge. So your adventurer, your cattle farmer who's having problems, is going to have somebody he's blaming. Yeah, this is because of the fact that I treated old woman Rutherford badly, and I know she's a witch, so she's the one that did this to me, right? There has to be some reason or purpose for there to be an antagonist, and once the players are aware of the antagonist, they now can react to it. So that would be that. Now, if you're saying that it's not that, what is the source of the powder? What is the source of the... Where is it coming? Where is it coming from? Okay, it's a good one. The next thing is you need to know the truth. Game masters often get foiled by this because they think I'll build all this mystery up and then my players will solve it. But if the players can't get to the actual solution you have in mind, you at least have to have some way of explaining how it happened, so that if they get it completely wrong, you can bring them back to the story. Because if not, then they're just going to go kill old Mother Hubbard or whatever, and the story will go in a negative fashion, and it won't go where you want it to go as a story. So you need to know the truth. You need to know what happened, how they came to be where they are, or whatever. So now you know the subject, you got the mechanism, you got your antagonist, the one that they're going to blame, all the evidence that points to them, all the evidence that exonerates them. You need to have pieces for every one of those. But these are all small bits, right? This is just little pieces of the story about the cattle. Now, is there a solution? Is there a step in the process that isn't being fulfilled that could be? Is there something that the farmer can do that can prevent it in the future? The historical concept would be, well, if you kill the witch, then the curse stops. So is there any mechanism that means that's going to be true? Or does the witch hunt continue after they've killed old Mother Hubbard or whatever? You have to think about what the... Okay. That's why it happened. What's the solution? For an adventure to come to a close, to be able to be done in a one-shot, why would it be a conflict between the farm and the town if the farm has nothing to do with it? If the poor farmer is only getting in trouble because his cattle are getting sickly, it's not his fault. You've already said it's a chemical fault. So what are you going to do to make it so that the game master... that the farmer can get out of being in trouble? Do they murder the farmer? Do they stop buying his cattle and he goes out of business? What's the outcome? You have to find a way to close the loop. Because when you start a story, you're creating questions in the mind of the viewer. And as you go along, you want to answer those questions stroke by stroke until they finish drawing the picture. Because it's the players who want to solve it. And you want your players to solve it. Okay, but when you say the town is doing the thing, what is the solution? Is the town going to stop production? If it was making them money, they're going to keep doing it. Sure, you can do that, but you need to have a closure. You need to have a completion of the loop. Because if you leave the hooks always hanging out in front of your players and you don't do anything to complete it, your players don't stay. They want to know, we finished that story. Now we go to the next story. And then we go to the next story. And they can link. You could have this chemical that they're making is actually being made everywhere, that it's a new discovery that was found in a city in the south, and it spread like wildfire before anybody knew anything about the controls. And so it's happening everywhere. So you can keep going back So you can choose one side or the other, but if you're going to choose the side that kills off the cattle, then your town doesn't have any more food. Your prices go up, and your players don't want to live in that town anymore. And you don't have anybody producing the cattle anymore, and that farmer's out of business. So you have to think, okay, you're creating intrinsically, but you have to think extrinsically. You got to think outside of what's going on. And so you've got to have, pardon my, you must have a solution. It doesn't have to be the solution, but you have to have a way for the players. So, if I might add, in this case, my thinking is, okay, I've got a farmer who's selling cattle and they're getting sick. He knows that it has something to do with the food and water. He knows where he gets the food because he grows it himself. So therefore, it's probably not going to be the food. It's probably going to be the water. Well, if it's the water, where's the water coming from? Well, all I can do is walk upstream. You walk upstream, you're going to see it's the processing center for this new material. Well, that's new. That's pretty obvious. But the owner of that business, and you say the town, I think you have to realize that the town isn't the culprit in this case. It's the business owner who's actually doing the thing. He's actually creating the problem, and he doesn't care. More than likely, he doesn't know, but he does not care. So, okay, but you're pushing the problem downstream, no pun intended. If you say, yeah, he can now run a different channel, that means somebody's paying for that. Somebody's taking the time to dig that trench to put in the new water supply. And if you bring a new water supply in, what are you doing with the old water supply? It's still filtering bad crap into the ground, and there's going to be other things starting to die. The grass itself could start to be suffering from it. What is that material? In the world of Nykos, it's pretty easy. I can totally see this happening where somebody's actually processing to get a pure chemical out of the ground. In the process, they are filtering out the magics. And the magics flowing through the ground are enough to cause animals to get sick and things like that because they're getting an overdose of magics. And therefore, it would be really colorful on Nykos because maybe the fish are belching flowers or whatever. The mechanism can be clever or whatever. That's one possibility. Now, where's that other chemical coming from? If it's if difficult price or difficult concept or high price to bring it in, now you're expanding. My point is that you're not solving the problem to finish the adventure. You're adding new hooks. You're adding new clever bits, and that's great, but you need to finish the cycle first. Once you finish the cycle, then you can figure out what you want to add in to make it more interesting or more dynamic or a larger scale or whatever. The idea of a cow farmer with problems can be a level 1 encounter, but that same cattle conflict can continue the next week when his cattle's babies are born with mutations, and now you got a problem with the secondary branch. So is it the same chemical or another? So, okay. Great. So you've created the cocaine, the caffeine business. That the idea of adding something to a drink to make it safe and tasty. I don't know if you know this, but that's ironically that's a whole religious argument. Believe it or not, I've had a problem with the Christian churches for this one for a long time. But the idea of unfermented grape juice in communion is a problem because that's not what was called for in the Bible. It says to drink wine. And so therefore the creation of unfermented grape juice and the replacement of wine with this unfermented grape juice is actually fundamentally an abomination because you're putting something man-made in a place that was made by God. But that is what this is talking about. You got a powder you're adding that's going to make the citrus a safe, tasty drink. Great. That's coming from someplace, and there's a byproduct that's being pumped out. Clearly, we have that is knowing your subject, and now we know who your antagonist is. You even know the mechanism, but now we have to know the truth. How do we fix it? One answer. Don't spread out. What is the one answer? Yes, that's again. You're adding more nuances. I want to know what the solution is. If all you were going to do in a perfect world,
one thing would finish the game. What would be that one thing? The destruction of the business, prevention of it happening, or counteraction of the effect. Either one of them is a valid conclusion, but you have to decide. You have to decide because you have to know when the game is over. Because what you do when your brain goes into this pattern that you're representing is it's exactly why you're having a hard time with one-shots. Because when you start down the one-shot rabbit hole, there's a bunch of things pop up and say, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And those are all great. And they're all useful. And they can expand the story beyond the first. But we got to get through the first one first. We have to conclude it. So, for example, just using your example, you run into cattle, find out there's a problem. You investigate the problem, find out about the water problem. Follow the water problem, you find out about the company. Two choices. Fight the company owner, make him shut down. Or find another water source. But those are choices. But you have to pick one of them to be the conclusion of this event so that they can continue. They can now have the checkbox of, we finished, we succeeded, the adventure's done. That way you finish it. Now this is really a simple one. So I'm just trying to show an example. We'll go back and expand because obviously we're going to want more. But we have to close the circuit. So what is your solution? With no players involved. You're just the storyteller. You're telling me this story. What's the solution? Does the farmer move his cattle to another field and use therefore a different water supply? Or are you going to shut down the producer? Give me one or the other. Doesn't matter. Okay. So now you've told me why it can't be the one. That's fine. Therefore, it has to be the other. We have to stop the production. We have to. If we want to solve this problem, we have to stop the production. That could be fight the guy or whatever. Okay, so now you've expanded the theme. Just realize our theme, knowing our subject, was a farmer with a problem. Now you've expanded. This is way our brains work. This is natural. But you have to decide where you're drawing that line. So, okay, let's say it's now a group of farmers and they're all being suffering because that one person's poisoning the entire water source. Therefore, the idea of having another aqueduct doesn't really work because you can't feed all of those farmers. So that leads back to the inexorable, I've got to stop this production. Now, yes, you got people that have money involved that don't want it to be shut down. You have reasons for the city to want to expand their marketplace or whatever. So, okay, I'm waiting. Okay, now again, you are continuing to expand. You have to go with know your subject. There has to be one subject. And you've now made it 3. Because it's not just one farmer, it's a collective of farmers. So you're solving the puzzle as a player would by coming up with new conjecture. When you do that, you give yourself a hemorrhage because you're not going to be able to solve it because each time you're going to add another layer. Okay, you say a collective town. Does that mean slave labor? Are we talking about voluntary collectivism? Because historical collectivism didn't occur because they simply couldn't, because you couldn't trust. Right, you can't trust a collective government. Nobody would. Historically, they didn't exist.
You could not have a collective governing system until you had accountability mechanisms, which is Soviet era, Stalinist era. Because until then, you don't have a group that can be strong collectively. Even unions, even in guilds, don't have that kind of power. Okay, you keep using words that are dangerous. When you say the town, who are you talking about? If everybody in town's hair is falling out, they would stop it. They would stop it. They would get their pitchforks and staves and torches, and they'd go out to that guy's house, and they would burn it to the ground. They would destroy his business. You're not poisoning my people. You're not killing my kids anymore. But they do. They have to know. Yes, you introduced the concept, and now you've expanded. You've realized we're still getting bigger and bigger. We're not actually solving. Yeah, but we're still not solving it. You're coming up with new terms, but you're not solving. You're not setting one case and solving it. You're creating multiple cases and then trying to solve all of them at once, but you can't because each one of them has a different piece. So if the one shot is one encounter, it literally has to be the farmer and his cattle, or the town and their hair loss. One of these. Don't take all of them. Pick one. Because when you pick one, then you can make a one-shot adventure. Because you are creating a multi-shot adventure by expanding the concept beyond that. So if we're going to stay with the one farmer, then the idea of a curse against one farmer by one witch, one naysayer, goes right back to our original story. Knowing our subject, cows are dying. Knowing the mechanism, stuff in the water. Knowing the antagonist is a falsehood because that antagonist that we've chosen isn't really the problem. It's actually the stuff upstream. You know the truth, which is that guy who created that business has to be accountable for what he does. And then you have to have a solution, which is confrontation with that business. Now, yes, that business might have long tendrils. That business might have association beyond it. But your one shot is concluded because you got to the source of the matter. The very following week, the very next session, you can say, okay guys, remember we talked about that farmer? We definitely rounded him up and got him to stop. Well, as you may not know, he actually had financial backers, and 3 more guys have shown up, and they're expanding that ranch. And they're expanding their production, and even more farmers. You see what I'm saying? So now you can continue to story beyond. But you have to isolate your terminology. So farmer, producer. Producer is a single person. Producer is a business. That business isn't the town. So there's still a town that should be defined. Well, that town is going to have barristers and chamberlains and whatever in the middle of that. So there's going to be a breakdown over that. So you can keep doing this. But does the business want to kill cattle? If the business wants to kill cattle, then that is a problem that has to be solved at a higher level. Because that cannot go on because your farmers with death will move and your town goes away. Yes. What I'm getting at is you build the one shot so it has a conclusion. This is the mystery to a one-shot adventure. Build it so it has a conclusion, because then it is a one shot. We're done. The players never have to go there again. They never have to follow that storyline again unless you want them to. In which case, then you take that one shot and use it as a catalyst, and then you build the next level beyond that. No, I get that you want to go, you can go to multiple sessions, but I'm telling you that from a standpoint of creation, you say you can't find one-shot materials. The reason why you can't find one-shot materials is that nobody is writing this way. Nobody is doing the work of saying there's a conclusion. You have to do that when you do a one-shot. Otherwise, it's not a one-shot. It's actually a short series or it's a long saga. And you choose which you're going to run. But don't run saying you're doing a one-shot when you're doing... Why is nobody doing it? I'll tell you why nobody's doing it. Because if somebody does what a game master like myself does, they become game masters. If I could do this, which I do every time I play, when you are able to build a story so there is a resolution point at the end of the session, the series, or the saga, if you're able to come up with a conclusion at the end of that, you own the gold mine. Because players want conclusion. Now, it's interesting, the fact that we went through that exercise and I had to kind of, pardon the phrase, I had to kind of beat you up on it. This concept of having to come to a conclusion. My reason for doing that is this. The human brain is fed on curiosity. We actually get dopamine and endorphins flooding into our system when we're given an impossible conundrum to work on. We start to build all these conjectures, all these possibilities, and they stimulate us and they excite us. But if you never get a conclusion on it, you will burn out your dopamine receptors and that won't be fun anymore. A player that comes to your group to play in a one-shot, you say, I'm going to play a one-shot next week. And you run that game and it doesn't come to a conclusion because you got to expand it because the story's getting bigger. And then you run a second session and you run a third session. By the third or fourth session, they're going, come on, dude, you said this was a one-shot. I'm now tied up 4 weeks into an adventure. I just wanted a one-shot. So realize that your ability to micromanage, to bring it down to a conclusion, makes you the genius. Makes you what the players want. Because they're getting that conclusion, because conclusion is a release. You're no longer getting the endorphins, and it's not a downer. It's like, oh. A great example is, have you watched Scooby-Doo, the TV show with the dog? Scooby-Doo adventures were always the same thing. A mystery is being perpetrated upon a place by people who know the truth and are hiding it. When they hide it, they then cover it up with something spooky, eerie, or unexplainable, which causes this endorphin. There's a ghost in town. We got to figure out where the ghost is and why it's here. So that endorphin rate excites and energizes the viewer in the story. But at some point, Fred and Velma figure out that it's actually the evil neighbor next door who's been pumping the chemicals into the water supply. And so they get the authorities and they shut him down. Adventure over. Shaggy and Scooby get their Scooby snacks. And of course, there's really never a ghost. It was just the guy in the costume. Or was there? That's the way those work, is there's always that air of possible mystery. But they solve every time. If you don't solve the case, you leave unsatisfied players, and after the third or fourth jump scare of thinking they're going to have a conclusion and they don't get it, they get frustrated, and you harm your player base, and you disappoint yourself because you're not following through on it being a one-shot. So I'm suggesting okay. Why is the Remoras there? Yeah, sure. There you go. People are vanishing at night. We go to find out. We come across a Remoras. Obviously, the Remoras has been eating people. So we can kill it or lead it away. But if you're looking for something you could add to it, why is there Remoras this low down in the mountains? Is there something above it that's causing the Remoras to come this far south? There you go. There you go. You got one. That's the way you write them. Right there. You have now created your first. See, I told you we would do it. You've done your first homebrew. Right there. Boom. Done. It's done. Gloss it up. Fill in the gaps. Talk about the people that got kidnapped. Maybe have them find some remains and the weird marks on the ground. Maybe the snowy. Yeah. Right. Sure. Makes perfect sense. But remember, Remoras are supposed to be in ice territory because they burrow through the ice. So if he's down low enough to get into a town that's just snowy, maybe there's something else that's going on beyond. I wouldn't say that he belongs to somebody. Remoras are chaotic in their nature. They're just voracious eaters. So you don't have to do anything sophisticated like it belonging to someone. You could, I suppose, if you had somebody who up the mountain is a Remora's tracker and he actually is breeding them or something, but you don't need that. And that's also add in. Well, there is, again, snow and mud isn't necessarily the environment of a Remoras. It's a polar ice worm. It lives in the ice. Its ability is to turn on the heat and burrow through the ice at movement speed. So it is specifically for glacial environments. So if he's down at the snow level, there might be something that's driving him down. Also, if it's a young Remoras, why wouldn't they have known about him from others that were in the area? And if he's young, why would there even younger ones found? So, yeah. So if he's being driven south for food, that means his food supply up in the mountain pass has been curtailed. What drove his food away? When you start, this is how you link them. As you go, okay, yes, we found the Remoras, we've killed it, we've driven it away, drove it back into the mountains where it belongs. But why did it come down here? That's your second adventure. Now, why does that? I have a problem with Remoras as a pet. That'd be like a pet viper or a scorpion. They're not traditionally pet-like animals. And even if you did have them as a pet, you would just basically keep them contained. So again, did he come down here because he got out? If he was a pet, he was being maintained in a location for a purpose. So maybe he was a guardian, but he's gone from his guardian post. So each individual story, like I said, the Remoras piece is a complete story. Great. But if you want to enhance the player experience, their scratch in their head is still going to be, why is he here? Okay. Natural progression. That means best bet is to kill the thing because this is not sustainable for him to be eating food in our biome. So finish him off. Most humane thing to do. Sure. Now you finish the story. Good job. But do you see what I'm saying? If you know this, if you know the subject, you know the mechanism, you know the antagonist, you know the truth, and you have a solution, the story's done. That's your one shot. Boom. A multi-shot or a series of adventures is stories just like this that are linked one to the next to the next. And they can be linked up side by side so they're parallel, so they can be linked serially so they're one after the other like a railroad train, or they can be separated by space and happen to be coincidental. There's all kinds of different ways. But you've got now the story. Great. Remoras came down. Now, if he's being driven down because of food supply, and that's purely what it is, that he's the young and got kicked out of the nest, fine. Kill it, and you're done. Yay, story over. Go on to another one. You just realize that being a storyteller of single-shot stories is still a storyteller, and then the linking of one story to the next becomes your next point of art, because you can build this. You could tie those two stories together. We're having a rate increase because our cattle are being poisoned. Why are they being poisoned? Because the farmer brought his cattle down out of the high pastures because he didn't want it to be eaten by the Remoras. So we go up north and we hunt down the Remoras. We kill it. Yay! Now we go back up the field. Nobody has to know about the water problem or whatever, and your evil corporation can still exist, right? So that's one way to do it. Or no, they actually found out about the evil business and they shut it down first, so the town is back in peace. But as they moved out to the larger fields, they find out about the Remoras, and now they've got the Remoras to deal with, and so now you have to solve that puzzle. But the whole point is that the sequencing of the games are what make you a games master. Because you can be a dungeon master. You can run a story right through the map, running every room and doing all of that. That's dungeon mastery, and that's fine. But to be a games master, you got to be able to link one story to the next, across the branches, and from genre to genre, and from theme to theme, and have some methodology. And so by using this mechanism right here, these four no's and a half, that's pretty funny, four and a half no's. having this mechanism, you can write any one shot you want. And so therefore, don't think about building the long haul. In my case, I started running Dungeons and Dragons games when I was 11. And when you're 11 years old, all you want to do is open the door, kick the monster in the face, and get the treasure, right? That's all you're doing is you write down 3 lists. What rooms, what monsters, what treasures. What rooms, what monsters, what treasures. Then you get clever and put in secret doors. Then you get clever and put in sliding passages. Then you put in some traps. Then you start, but that's building the process. Well, once you get down to being a really good game master, you got to get the players from one game to the next. So you have to start being a storyteller, and you're dragging people across the country, going from one village to the next to go up to the dungeon. But you got to make that story compelling, or all the players aren't going to go through it. So you got to build that story. As you build single shots. Build it when you. I don't know if you know anything about armory, but if you're going to build a suit of armor, you have to make a lot of rings. There's videos out on people who make armor, and they actually take a steel rod and soft wire, and they wrap the wire round and round and round and round and round and round and round on the rod until they're just this long, thin, spring-like form. Then they take out their little jewel saw and cut down the seams of all of them. Now they're all individual rings. Now you decide whether your armor is going to be a 3-ring, 5-ring, or a 7-ring. Circle it. 6-ring, circle it. And you slide the rings onto one ring, and then you add 6 more rings to the next one, and 6 more rings to the next one. Then you go back and hook the 6-ring group to the 6-ring group, and the 6-ring group to the 6-ring group. Then you take the 16 slices and put together and make a sleeve. This process lets you build it up. Okay, we've already got 2. Pick 2 other monsters you want to use and build, and you're good to go. So yeah. Right. Now, here's where the open world will get you in trouble. If you build open world and you build 5 units, and the following week the players come in and they choose decision A, and everything is well and good. But as they go along pathway of treasure A, they consider their options and decide they want to go back and do B. But you already have B leading to C mechanically in your head, right? So you have to figure out where they are compared to each other and find a way of keeping them flexible. Yes, that's exactly what Nikos was. You start with a location and you build around it, and then you build another starting location and you build around it. And that's exactly what I'm talking about as far as the chain links. The chain links, the individual rings, are your one-shots. Have a billion of them. Have the ability. Now that you have the ability, you could actually create one on the fly. Because you could just simply say, what would be a cool idea we could go with from here? And then take that one idea and make a story that includes a conclusion. You still have to have a solution. But you just make every single one of those little ringlets. Then you put the rings and you push them together and connect them. Once you do that, the players will help you fuse it and it becomes solid. Then you go on to the next one and the next one. So, exactly. Welcome to Dungeon Mastery. That's the game. That's where you go from being a Dungeon Master to a Games Master. Because now you're having to think on your feet because the players are going to have conclusions that you didn't plan on or you weren't thinking of or you didn't write an adventure to cover. So now you get to write some more. You've got it. You've got it actually right. And this is the reason why having a solid idea of what creatures live in an environment will give you the 20 or so monsters that they could pull from. And as they move out from that, you could add or 2 or 3 to the list and take 1 or 2 off because of where they are geographically as far as the type of climbs and everything so that you can make it all coherent over time. Yes, you've got it. Strigley's the Game Master. Yay! Yay! Exactly. You make the map so you know the environment, and therefore with the environment, you can create the list of 20 monsters. As you go from environment to environment, that list changes, and therefore the possibility of what encounters they run into is going to change. There'll be some overlap, so it's okay to have a boat, for example, on a coastline, even though a boat doesn't necessarily travel on the coast. So he's that's okay. You've got a reason for that encounter to exist in the hinterlands between. But now you've got what it takes to be a game master. You have your map. Now you have an idea of what the environments are. Now you build 20 micro encounters, or at least have the ability to create them. Yes, you now have the secret of campaigns. The campaign is a series of cleverly interlinked, sequenced one-shots. You can't get to Rivendell unless you go through Helm's Deep. Not Helm's Deep. Have to go through Weathertop. Weathertop could have a bunch of different encounters, but you have to pass through Weathertop. So knowing that Weathertop has wolves and orcs and goblin men or whatever, this hodgepodge gives you a chance for the players to have a different course through it. Now we got something else. Have you seen my video on non-player characters? I call it how a game master plays the cast of thousands. If you haven't, I recommend that video, because in this case, what you're talking about is don't have 50 pre-made NPCs that are vanilla. Don't just write down commoner, blah, 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 commoner, blah, blah, blah. No, say, I've got this guy's an innkeeper, this guy is a stable boy, this guy is that. So that way you know where they fit in the story. But non-player characters break into a bunch of different categories. You have non-player characters that I call nudes. I got to say the word nudes. Non-essential window dressing. That's the guy that comes and gets your horse and takes the horse to the barn for you. Doesn't matter. We don't care what his name is. We don't care if it's a male or female. We don't care what his background is, what his species is. Just want to get it. So non-player character that is a non-essential window dressing is a nude. And you have to have lots of nudes. So don't worry about building much about them. Just a description and a hair color, and you're pretty much good to go. Then you've got your recurring NPCs or RNPCs or RPCs. And a recurring player character, recurring non-player character, is a persona that the party is going to run into session after session. Usually this is the guy that's handing out the quests, or he's the guy that's paying the bills, or he's the innkeeper that they have to come with their monthly payments or whatever. So that's a recurring NPC. They have to be fleshed out somewhat. You have to have a little bit of knowledge about them. Maybe you even give them a motivation so the players can then appeal to that when they need to get extra benefits and stuff. It's a possibility. Next are SPCs. And SPCs are probably the most overplayed NPCs out there. This is, if you think about it, it's the guy that's standing outside the castle, looking fervently for the adventure group. So when they come in, he's immediately running over to tell them, you got to do this thing. That's a story NPC. And if he's that blatant and obvious, then he should probably be dead, because anybody who isn't wanting the story to go forward would have taken him out. But the idea is that a story PC is somebody that's absolutely essential, but only for this episode. So this would be the King's Herald, or the Queen's Maiden, or whatever. It's a person that's critical to getting information to the party, but he's not essential to them month over month. So you've got the NPCs, the WEDs, the nudes. You have the RPCs, you have the SPCs, and then you have the CPCs. And CPCs are probably the ones that get you in the most trouble. A CPC is a cast-off player character, almost always carrying a red herring, a non-essential storyline, intentionally to mess with the players. And the cast-off NPCs are kind of like the nudes, only you've actually gone so far as to give them a name and such. And they really have only one of two choices. If you have a CPC and you've used it in an adventure and the guy is angry because he got shafted or treated badly or whatever, he has two choices. He either falls into the category of nude and just wanders off, it doesn't matter anymore, or he becomes your villain. A villain NPC has got to be somebody that the players are aware of, that the players see as an equal, and that they see as a threat. If you can pull that off with your NPC, you have a gold mine, because now that NPC matters to the players, and they will go out of their way to try to hunt him down. So having a big list of NPCs is really useless. It's just numbers on a page. I have a book that I created at one point which has like 90, and I've never used all of them. I started using them, and then I realized that it's really not. So, okay, so villain. Here's what you do with a villain. You want a villain. You want a perfect villain. Have it be somebody that wants to do exactly what the players are doing, but he's too late. He comes to town. He's a sorcerer. He's heard about the poison of the cattle. He's worked on a cure. He's an alchemist. He's come up with a chemical that the cows can drink that makes them healthy again. And he comes out to the farm and he found out the players already solved the problem and drove off the business, and there's no longer a problem, and his chemical is useless. Man, is that guy going to be pissed. I did all this work. I deserve to have their attention, and they ignored me. I am now a villain, and I have sworn that party is my enemy. So now every time I find out what they're doing, I'm going to find a way to break their plan. That's a great NPC, great villain. Or you have them in a fight with the guy in a room, and there's one guy that survives and gets away. Great villain. The one that got away becomes the greatest villain ever because the players all want to be the one to take him out. So that's two ways to get to a villain. I think the real thing I noticed earlier in the conversation about the farm is that you don't want to make villains. Think about that for a second. You don't want to make villains. Because when I'd asked you the story of who was causing the cattle to be sick, you said the business. Or no, you said the town. So you made it nondescript. Really? The entire town? Is that to get them? No, the town's got this business and they really want the business. Oh, so it's the business owner. No, because he's actually working for a bigger concern or whatever. So, okay, I'm telling you, everything that we're talking about right here is how you have more than combat. They find out cattle are sick. They're not going to go and kill the cow. They got to go find out what's killing the cow. They're going to want to see a monster. They're going to think there's going to be a monster. They're going to go out. They're going to find the land. They find there's nothing wrong. They may not even find the water as a source because they're not thinking about it. But all you have to do is, as a game master, have one of them accidentally take a drink of water. Now one of them's getting sick. Well, how did I get sick? Well, what did you do today? Well, we went through that guy's farm. Yeah, but what did you do different from the rest of us? Because you're the only one that's sick. Oh, well, I had some water from that river. Ah! That still doesn't make him the villain. That just means that the water upstream is a problem. So you covered up by making it say it was the town. And then you said it was the business. And then you said it was a conglomerate. You were trying to paint it. Sometimes people make bad decisions. And those bad decisions make them bad guys. If I went and bought a chemical and I was poisoning my neighbor's cattle, I would be responsible for it. And in our law system, I would go to jail or I'd have to pay for it. In that case, that story, you need to stop my business. So, okay, why did the players steal from an NPC? Because aren't they actually the ones who made him the villain? Because they actually showed villainous behavior first? And why do you have your players stealing anything? The kind of the point of being the heroes is that they are the good guys. Well, if it had a name on it, they know it was somebody else's. And if they don't, somebody needs to take them back to culture school, or maybe the culture needs to be explained to them, or maybe somebody needs to show them a similar case and show them how it's a bad thing. But if they stole something, then they are nemesis, but they are actually the nemesis. They are the ones who broke the rules. Does that make sense? You've made them the bad guys. Which is not bad. That's a comment I get quite a bit from my games group is, are we the villains? Are we the bad guys? Right. They stole from him. They are the bad guys. Right. This doesn't make him a bad guy. Arguably, he's a protagonist to the party who are the antagonists. Because they are the ones who did an act that is immoral and therefore set this in motion. If at any point the players realize that they did something wrong and set it in motion, they could make your story derail by simply fixing it, right? I don't care whether the players know it. You know it. As game master, you know they are the violent ones. You should have your forensic scientists or whatever, your technologists or whatever, going through that crime scene with a fine-tooth comb. And even if you don't find anything, you certainly should put the fear of God into your players, because you need them to know what they did was wrong. Maybe one of them starting. If you have a cleric in the party, he should be immediately having bad dreams that tell him that you're bad. You know, Ebenezer Scrooge and seeing Jacob Marley. So the players need to be made aware that they did something wrong. And if you want the guy to be the bad guy, then the bad guy already was the bad guy, and their stealing it was not really a bad thing. But it's still morally ambiguous, and you need them to know that they had to make a moral decision. Doesn't sound like they were given much choice. You just let them do a bad thing and then make it worse by starting a fire. That's two bad things. None of that's a good thing. If they went and stole it because they knew he was a bad guy and wanted the list for that reason, then they lit the fire. That's arson. They knew what they were doing. Either which way, this is a situation where your players are problematic, and you need to give them the out, give them the way for them to come clean. Doesn't matter. Doesn't mean that he'll forgive them. Doesn't mean he won't want to avenge them, but it does give them the opportunity to clean their consciousness, because they are in the wrong. As a player, you do not want your players doing immoral behaviors and rewarding or being benefiting from it, because that's antithesis of the hero's journey that players are traditionally on in a role-play game. Well, we've now gone 2.5 hours past my stopping time for tonight, so yes, that's what may happen in the long term, even if they clear their names. But give them a chance to clear their names, because otherwise he is in the right to have done this thing. Because that's what police do. They go get a posse and they go after the bad guy. That's not a wrong thing to do if the good guys are the bad guys. We can argue till the cows come home. That's fine. You're obviating the point. The point is that the players know that they did a bad thing. They have to know that they did a bad thing. And if they don't know, then you have to let them know, because they broke the code by stealing. And if they are going to justify it, they still need to come clean with the authorities. Go to the town cops and say, look, we found this guy and he's a bad guy because he's doing bad things, and so we are hunting him. But here's why we did it. And we didn't mean to start the fire, blah, 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 blah. But you need to give them the way to clear their name. Otherwise, you are just continuing to propagate an error that the players are still going to feel like they deserved when they get beat up by the bad guy. So, Strigley, I'm going to have to bail on you. It's almost 1:30 in the morning, and we did a lot tonight. I'm really glad we had this great conversation, and I'm glad we have this on Twitch. I'm going to make a highlight out of the whole thing so that it can be found again here, and then I'm going to come back and cut and paste it. I'm probably also going to use this outline for tomorrow's Game Master Soapbox. So I want to thank you again for being here. I thank you for the conversation. And yeah, there's so much to unpack in that little story that we're telling that I can't go into, because I would be here for another 3 hours. So it's been great. It's been a great conversation. I want to thank you again for being here. Thanks for watching NycosRPG. We are on every night as much as I can, 9 p.m. Pacific, for the Session Zero Chronicles. And if I can't do that, I'm at least here every night at 11 p.m. for Game Master Soapbox. And this has been that, and we will see you the next time. Have a great night.